Right, so it looks like the number of attendees has stabilized. First of all, welcome to this third session of day 4 of the Rethinking Economics Festival. Got to say thank you for tuning in to this specialist session. My name is Benedict Goodman. I'm part of Rethinking Economics Norway. I've been part of the movement for about 4 years, and I've recently graduated with a Bachelor in Economics. And I'm about to do my Master's, and I'll be chairing this session. So we've called this session Teaching Pluralist Economics in Practice. And if you're like me, you've discovered that it's often very challenging to describe precisely what you want when campaigning for pluralism and a stronger focus on the real world in the education. And you know, when you suggest change, most academics often have little idea on how to teach economics in the way rethinkers often want or request. So that's why we've created this session to get past this impasse we very often find ourselves in. With us, we have Professor Jo Michell, who's one of the founding members of Reteaching Economics. So that's reteaching and not rethinking. Yeah, it's a network in the UK, and he's the secretary of the Post-Keynesian Economic Society, as well as an associate professor at the University of Western England in Bristol. We also have Cahal Moran, who wrote a little book that you might know called the Econocracy. Also a key instigator, I should say, in building the Rethinking Economics movement. He has now finished his PhD in economics, and nowadays he spends his time as a researcher at LSE. On the spare time, he runs a YouTube channel called Unlearning Economics, which I highly recommend that you check out. So the format of this event will be a webinar with where Jo will be delivering a talk first for about 20 minutes. And then Cahal will be a discussant, and we'll turn it more conversational between the two for about 15 minutes. And after that, we will open up for questions from the audience. So you can either raise your hand here on Zoom, or you can write down your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll read them out to the speakers. There should also be a voting function for the questions, and the highly voted questions will be picked. So get your votes out. With me, I've got Cecilia, who's part of Rethinking Economics Denmark, and is at the University of Copenhagen. She's also writing a curriculum review as we speak. Well, not right now, but you know. Do you have anything you want to say, Cecilia?
I can just say hi, everyone, and welcome.
All right, short and sweet. Okay, so before I'll let Jo get the word, I'll just lay down some rules. So since we're going to do the raise hand, please keep your questions succinct. We're after questions, not necessarily comments, so keep it to questions, please. And I think that is pretty much the only rule. Engage as you please. Oh, and don't spam the chat, please. Then Cecilia will get mad and she will remove you. So I feel I've said enough. I'll give the word over to Jo. Thank you for coming today, Jo.
Thank you. Great. Okay, sorry I'm a bit dark. I'm in the process of getting myself set up for online life, and I haven't quite got the lighting set up. But hopefully you can see me enough and hear me. It's probably more important. Okay, well, thanks very much for coming along. I'm going to say something about what I think an economics curriculum or economics degree should look like. These are somewhat sketched ideas. I'm certainly not putting this forward as a finished proposal, and other people will have ideas, and I'm sure these can be improved upon and finessed. So really I'm offering suggestions into the pot. I'm aware that we're simultaneous with a session on whether Black Lives Matter can be incorporated into a mainstream economics understanding or something along those lines. I'm certainly going to watch that one back on the replay, and it makes me realise that along with the recent scandal in economics to do with one of the editors of the Journal of Political Economy, it makes me realise that there's something very important all of us should be doing, which is trying to educate ourselves about these issues, and that I have a lot of work to do on this myself. I've increasingly understood in the last few months as this discussion has been going on. And I think some of the things one of the criticisms I would make of what I'm going to now say is that I haven't done enough on this particular issue. And I and the rest of us need to listen to those who are the experts on this, and I intend to do that. So with that preamble, let me jump in. I'm going to try and split my comments, and I'll use a few slides, but I'm not going to use them throughout just because I think it can get a bit tedious staring at a slide deck for however long somebody speaks. I'm going to split the way I talk into what would an economics education or curriculum look like in a kind of hypothetical ideal world where the last 50 years hadn't happened. Because I do think that economics as a subject has gone down some sort of blind alleys, and I can imagine a kind of counterfactual world where actually we haven't got to deal with the reality of where we are, but then I'll say, okay, that's not where we're up to, so let's now add back in actually existing reality. What else would we have to do, and what competing ends and objectives and optimization do we have to make to fit both of our desired education consumption choices into our final bundle? So so let me share the screen briefly for the first couple of slides. Hopefully that's coming through all right. So in an ideal world, what would an economics education like? The heavens have just opened here, so I've got thundering rain on the windows. Hopefully that's not coming through too loudly. And I think the question of what would an economics education look like opens up two immediate sub-questions, which I'm going to try and skirt over quickly while acknowledging. The first is, what is economics? What is the thing that we're studying? And the second is, what is the point of a degree education? So on the first, these are possible things. There are definitely more. It could be a domain of investigation. It's the thing we want to study, the economy. It could be about a set of policy questions. How should economic policy be set by policymakers? It could be a collection of methods and techniques. It could be we use optimization, we use differential algebra, we treat whatever problem or domain of investigation we come to as, basically interchangeable, and we use these techniques to try and answer any specific kind of question. And one thing I think that economics has done wrong is that it's moved in that direction. I think some people now regard economics as not things we want to investigate, but a set of things that we use regardless of what we're investigating. And I think that's a problem. Or is it theoretical navel gazing? Is it all just, wondering about whether the Cambridge Capital controversies, really invalidate the Cobb-Douglas production function, and, how many rates of interest are there in a hypothetical world of, fixed factor proportions, and so on. And my answer to this is that actually it's some combination of the above. It's a mixture, but it's not the bundle I would have chosen. The optimal mix of these things and the actual specifics in each one is not what I would like it to be. So I'm going to propose a different combination of these things that I think would be part of an economics education. And I do use the word education rather than training because there is a related question, which is, what should people get out of degree education? Are they being trained to do a specific job? And do you do an economics degree to be trained to be an economist so you can go and be an economist? And my answer to that is no. Now, a lot of people who do economics degrees won't become economists. I don't think a degree should necessarily be vocational training, although of course it should improve your capacity to go out and work and be part of that sphere of economic activity. But I think it should be much broader. It should be about expanding your ability to think. It should be about a whole range of things about improving and developing yourself as a person. So I do think economics education should give out rounded people who can go and do a whole range of things, but who have learned some useful ideas and techniques and history and logic and argument and so on. So I don't think of it as a vocational thing. So here is then my first sketch of what I would put into a curriculum in this hypothetical ideal world where the last 50 years hasn't happened. And what I'm going to do is go through these. I'll turn the slides off and go through these in a little bit of detail. I won't have time to say a great deal about each. But I think accounting is important. Economic history is important. People should talk about and think about and understand how things are produced and why and how things are consumed and who they are consumed by and in what kind of quantities. I think people have to understand something about money, banking and finance, and that's one of the more difficult and thorny areas. Macro, I think, is a big part of it. I'm a macro person myself, but I think I haven't got micro, you'll notice, but I do think macro is a, systemic properties. How does a system, or systems thinking, we could call it, if you like, rather than macro, but I think it's macro. Increasingly, people have to know about stats and data analysis. And I think even in the hypothetical world of, we're not in this big data Dom Cummings kind of world where everybody has to do a Bayesian decision tree in the morning. Some facility with, tables and charts and this kind of stuff is part of the game. I'm not one of those who thinks economics is an entirely non-quantitative subject. I do think it's quantitative. And some understanding of social relationships and power. And this comes back to the point I made at the start. And the sequence here does have some order to it. So I would probably think that, in a degree you have to do some things in parallel, but there's some degree of sequencing there. I do think macro could come after money, banking and finance for reasons I'll try and say a few things about. Okay, do I want to say anything else? So for now, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. I'm going to come back to my full screen and I'm just going to talk. It's getting darker and darker. I don't know why I'm getting darker in here. Maybe it's the weather. So let me say a little bit about each of these in turn. I'm influenced by there's two quotes stick in my mind when I think about this. One is Willem Bouter, and I don't know if he said this in public, but I was once talking to him and he was saying, economics is just accounting and history. That's what people need to learn in a degree. They need to understand which things they're measuring, how to measure them, and how to organize them on balance sheets, and they need to know the history of different episodes through that lens. Now, I think that's too narrow, but I think there's something to that. And the other thing that sticks in my mind is something J.W. Mason has said, which is that in his ideal world, the median economics paper is basically a piece of economic history with careful accounting. So I read his comment as saying something along the same lines as Willem Bouter. That said, I do think you need some other material in order to be able to do that kind of work, to say these are the things that happened and these are the things, this is why it happened in this order, and here is some kind of quantification of this. So let me say a few more things about these. So on accounting, I think one thing I think would be very important to start with, and I think this kind of goes back to Joan Robinson's point, for example, about no student is ever told what units capital is measured in. They're just brushed along, told to do the mathematics, and then they become a professor, and sloppy habits of thought become what the rest of the quote is, but you get the point. So one thing I would want to start with is, what are we measuring? Can we measure it? Is this something which actually you can put numbers on, or do we just have to be vague? There's the quote from Keynes about inflation and GDP, and he says, these are not things which you should put into the differential calculus. To say one is bigger than the other, or one has increased and the other one has decreased, is not meaningless, but you've got to be careful about quantification. So one thing I try and emphasize with students is think carefully about the units you're using. A physicist would always do this, I imagine, but in economics, it's amazing. I can talk to third years and say, what unit are you using for that, the x-axis of your graph? And I don't know, this is just the graph from the textbook. It doesn't say in the textbook, so how can you expect me to know? National accounting, I think, is essential, and this connects to money, banking, and finance, and macro. How to read balance sheets, corporate balance sheets, and so on. And increasingly, I think environmental accounting should be one of the very first steps of an economics education. How can we measure the damage that this economic activity is doing to the environment? Economic history, I think, should come early and is essential because it sets the domain. It says this is the subject we're going to study. And here are some things that happened in an economic framing, and I want you to have these in your mind when we then come to develop tools and theories. are these tools and theories helping you to understand these case studies that we've looked at? So I'm kind of increasingly of the view that we need to do some of that stuff before we say, right, well, let's do some calculus and here's a supply-demand diagram and so on, because I want people to have the question and the topic in mind before the tools. And we'll come to the question of which tools should people have. So some possible examples that could go into an econ history module. The Industrial Revolution is an obvious one, and I think does have a place. There should be something about slavery, empire, colony. There should be geographical case studies of countries at different levels of development in different points in history, so that people have an early understanding of the unevenness of capitalist development. And the post-war period, Bretton Woods, the inflation period of 60s and 70s, the breakdown of that era, I think is another really useful topic. There are obviously many others that could go into that. I think we should talk about production. How are things produced? How do we measure what's produced? What difficulties are there with coming up with index numbers and such like for production? How is production organized, both technically, physically, but also socially? What's the difference in factory production and people working from home on Zoom and so on and so forth? I would want to say something about consumption, who consumes what and in how much, but also why do people consume? What are the reasons that people have for consuming certain things? And I think this is something which is very much missing. I mean, it's in Veblen, of course, and you can make a case that it's there in some modern economics, but I think it should be a lot more, the question should be asked a lot more clearly before we say, this is how people decide. They have a set of preferences and an optimization technique. I think students should think about that and develop some ideas. Money banking and finance, I think, is crucial. And I think doing that early on as a way of hopefully offsetting misunderstandings later. I mean, I think a huge amount of economics does come from fundamental misunderstandings about macro, about things like, the government budget constraint as a household budget constraint, and interest rate theory, government spending more crowds out private sector investment, this kind of stuff, quantity theory of money. And so I think the only way to do that is to start with a more sensible approach earlier on. And in an ideal world, you'd never come to that other stuff, but obviously in the real world, we're going to have to. Macro, money flows accounting, components of income and expenditure, expansionary and contractionary tendencies, income distribution, inflation, banking, financial instability, simple multiplier models. I would want to teach people to work with identities, sectoral balances, and the Kalecki-Levy profit equation, for example. That's a lot already. And beyond that, do we have time for theory? Do we have time to do a lot of macro theory? I'm not sure. I mean, I think just getting those basic elements is a lot to do. And I think we probably do want some basic theory, but I would start with that stuff for macro. And statistical and data analysis. And I think I've probably said enough about that. Measurement issues, conceptual issues, questions about how is the data collected, how is it processed? Don't just go to the IMF and download a data set and think, this tells me whether poverty is improving or not improving. I'd like to do some case studies with people where they actually try and almost follow the number from somebody with a clipboard knocking on someone's door to the IMF data set, something like that, to instill a sense of caution with this kind of stuff. And basic statistical reasoning. And by that, I don't mean so much OLS, though I think OLS is useful and people probably should learn it, but I think understanding the way that statistical dynamics produces interesting emergent properties. So something like the Schelling model, I think, is very understandable for undergraduates. Those of you who don't know it, it's a model where you give units preferences about their neighbors, and if people have very slight preferences to have similar neighbors to themselves, then you get segregation. So this kind of statistical regularities, but also the statistical regularities we see in income distribution and wealth distribution, in the distribution of profit across firms. These are well-established statistical regularities, which nobody's yet really explained, although there's some interesting work at the moment in that direction, which, as far as I know, isn't in a great deal of undergraduate economic instruction. Right, have I got about 5 minutes left?
That's correct.
Excellent. Okay, so that's my ideal world. So let's now say, All right, what does reality look like? This is just going to involve me pressing a couple of buttons. Hopefully, all right, I've messed this up. Hold on. All right, let's try it this way. Share screen again. Okay, hopefully that's sharing. So where did we get to? Okay, in reality, there are many problems which prevent the thing which I've just suggested would be a good curriculum from being something you could slot in tomorrow into a university economics degree. I'm going to identify two barriers and then say something about, you know, what additional things would we have to add. So first is that the students have to understand the actually existing discipline. You know, we can't ignore all the stuff which I didn't mention, and actually you'll notice I didn't actually say anything about prices, I didn't say anything about exchange, I didn't say much about preferences, production functions. That is what most economics textbooks would teach as economics, and we can't just pretend that that isn't there, because students may need to leave our degree and do a master's somewhere else, for example, and if we don't prepare them, we're doing a disservice. That's one very simple reason why people have to understand this stuff. But this opens up, I think, all kinds of thorny problems, because economics is confusing enough as it is. I mean, standard basic undergraduate neoclassical theory, I think, is very difficult for most people to understand. Most students, I think, leave university able to do some of the manipulations quite successfully, but not with much deep thought about what is this really representing and how is it representing it. And then if you then start contrasting that with a heterodox understanding and trying to teach people about the Cambridge capital controversies, for example, you're going to have a mess. So this is a non-trivial problem, I think, of how to, you know, do pluralism, if you like. And then, of course, there are institutional barriers of all kinds, from departments who don't have people who want to teach this stuff, don't have people who could teach this stuff, actively don't want students teaching this stuff because they think this is all, you know, rubbish, and the real scientific stuff is, you know, is already well established. I'm summarizing these with a couple of neat memes, which I've borrowed from the Rethinking Economics account, which is very good at this stuff. I'm not going to read them out, but I think you get the point. So what else should an econ education contain, given the two sort of constraints or barriers which I've highlighted? First of all, history of economic thought. You know, we have to tell students about how the discipline got to where it is, and I would do that right at the front. You know, I do that in first year alongside economic history, I think. And I could say quite a lot about that, but I'm short of time. But there's a connection between these two things, so theory, marginalist models, optimization techniques, etc. I think it would be useful, and this was something I try and do in the way I teach at UE, is to introduce some of this stuff through history of economic thought. If you don't see a supply and demand diagram until, say, week 7 or week 8 of a history of economic thought module, when we get to Marshall, and Marshall finally puts together Ricardo's insight about declining marginal productivity in agriculture with a broader understanding of production, alongside emerging marginalist ideas about optimization on the demand side, i.e. consumption preferences, and he finally says, okay, we can put these two things together and get a supply-demand diagram. Of course, others did do it first. I think Corno probably had it beforehand, but it's famously a footnote in Marshall. And I think, you know, it takes 5 or 6 weeks to actually build up, you know, what is the content of each of those two curves. My hope is that you then see it rather differently as page 1, here is the law of supply and demand, and everything else, you know, follows from that. So I would put HET front and center. We have to put theory in, and that has to include marginalist models, optimization techniques. I should also say that I don't actually have a problem with a lot of this stuff. I think it's useful. I think it's relevant. The problem is treating it as the hammer which cracks every nut. The problem is treating this stuff as the only tool we have when it's one of a wide range. That's a big debate. Others would disagree, and I don't have time to talk too much about that. So all of that stuff, you know, including up to, you know, deviations, of course, from perfect competition and so on. And then heterodox theory, you know, Keynes, Kalecki, Minsky, all the good stuff that rethinking students have been agitating for a long time. Then the problem we have, I'm going to stop sharing again so I can get back to a screen, is how to fit all this stuff into, you know, only 3 years which stuff to include, which to leave out, and how to not just totally baffle your audience so they think, this is mad, I'm going to go and do a different subject. Okay, that is my time slightly overrun, so I'm going to stop speaking and let Cahal say something.
All right, Cahal, the word is yours.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Jo. That was really great. Like I said to Jo earlier, I'm going to do what the standard discussant does, which is pay a little bit of homage to what Jo said and then just launch into what I was going to say anyway. So I completely agree with the emphasis on what you would call like an inductive approach to learning, right? So you start with the world, you start with the history, you start with the measurement, and you have to understand that before you start solving, DSGE models or anything like that. Because the students, you come out of an education, you can solve it, you can pass the exams, but do you know what it means? Like Jo said, do you know what units you're measuring it in? And I think that, one of my opinions, which isn't very practicable at the moment, but I do think that the first year of economics education should not really contain models in any depth. I think it should be all that basic stuff, getting to grips with it. That's what biologists do. They learn all of the bones in the human body, and yes, it's horrible, but they do have to do that, and they come out knowing those basic facts about the world. So yeah, I absolutely couldn't agree more about that point. Another one you mentioned, which is something that kind of bothers me as an intellectual argument, not as a practical argument, is the idea that, we have to start with the basics. So Jo was saying, we have to teach students the basics of neoclassical theory. And this is something that Jo alluded to. This isn't basic. Yeah, it's basic neoclassical theory relative to advanced neoclassical theory, but basic neoclassical theory is really difficult to get your head around. It routinely confuses students. When you do the theory of the firm and the MC curve has to cross the AC curve at the right point, and the whole diagram's a mess. And it's all just completely wrong because firms don't face increasing costs anyway. So it's like, why are you learning this? Except as a kind of, what do you call it? Theoretical navel gazing. So, I mean, those are the types of things that I would ideally like to eliminate from the degree altogether, because they're just wrong. They're not simplifications. They're really confusing. I don't see the value in them. Of course, persuading people who actually teach those things of that is a little bit tricky. So moving on to like what I've made a couple of notes about what I plan to say, because I wanted to talk a little bit to this practical issue of teaching pluralism for the most part. So I mean, the way I conceptualize it is it's a real kind of tightrope that we're walking, because trying to get what the Rethinking Economics and Reteaching Economics are calling for implemented into curricula in a way that respects the real institutional constraints. So you've got that kind of drop on the one side, the institutional constraints, and not respecting those and making your proposals completely unrealistic, but also avoids on the other side the drop of watering them down so much that they basically aren't really what we were looking for anyway. So on the side of the institutions, I mean, Jo's already spoken to this, but it's pretty reasonable, to be honest, I think, for an academic who didn't know what post-Keynesian economics was before you went to their office to say, how am I going to teach a module on this? Of course, to any real level that's acceptable for a teacher, that's completely true. And it's difficult for departments to hire those economists because they're not rewarded by the incentives that universities face for producing the right type of research. So that's a real constraint. And there's also the fact that you're dealing with humans, and humans, especially academics, are very stubborn, and they're not going to just root and branch reform everything they do. Also, to that point, academics, I mean, a lot of universities these days have a very high student to staff ratio, and academics are under a lot of pressure. And I used to dismiss this when I was a student. I used to say, well, just pull your finger out. But having actually been involved in designing courses, I can appreciate what a huge task it is. And in something, like I said, in something that you don't know too much about, under a lot of time constraints, it really is difficult. So we've got to acknowledge those constraints, and we've got to make proposals that can be practicable, because we're not going to get from where we are to pluralist utopia overnight. We're going to have like steps along the way, and steps which are also desirable in their own right. So that's kind of the when we're walking the tightrope, that's the drop I see on one side. To speak to the other side, the idea that our proposals might be watered down by so much that they're no longer recognizable as what we wanted. Now, anybody who has studied the history of mainstream economics will know that the mainstream is extremely good at doing this. They're extremely good at absorbing criticism and turning it into something which they say addresses the criticism, but which doesn't. So the primary person or set of ideas they did this with was Keynes and the idea of fiscal stimulus. So this was a whole theory, you know, the general theory, and then it turned into just basically something that looks like a supply and demand diagram that you've relabeled the axes. And it misses a lot of what Keynes wanted. I'm talking about the ISLM curve, by the way, for anyone who didn't get that reference. So yeah, it got turned by Hicks into the ISLM curve, and it missed so much of what Keynes was talking about. And it's so different to what post-Keynesian economics looks like now. Similar, more recently, behavioral economics. This idea that people aren't rational has been turned, at least in some quarters of the mainstream, into just another utility function with some more parameters in it. That's like, there's a little weighted bias and you know, it's just a little quirk of human decision making. And the rational model is still the benchmark, and you're still using the same type of mathematics, which again, I don't think is the type of thing that a really deep behavioral critique of the mainstream would get at. So my concern, so rethinking economics, what have we called for? Well, we've coalesced around this idea of 3 pillars. Is that 3? Yeah, so 3 pillars, right? Of an economics education, right? We want it to be critical, so the student is required to think critically, to come to some independent judgment using facts, using argument about the economy or the economic issue that they're discussing. It needs to be pluralist, right? So that means many theories instead of just one, instead of just the mainstream, or instead of just any mainstream, you know, there needs to be many theories taught. Then the student can decide which one or which combination of theories works best. And then there's real world, which is kind of self-explanatory. Jo was talking a lot about historical context, you know, situating economics in reality, essentially, and testing theories empirically. So there's those 3 pillars. Now, I think the standout one for rethinking has been pluralism. And what I'm concerned about with pluralism is that the same thing is going to happen to it that happened to Keynesianism, which is that it gets absorbed into the mainstream, and they say they've implemented it when they haven't. So I don't know if there's anyone who's involved in core in the audience, maybe not. So there's some nice things I could say about core, but we don't have time, so I'm going to skip to the not nice things. So what I've seen recently is the core textbook, sorry, just to give people background, is like the mainstream's response to the crisis in economics education. And it's full of kind of a lot more context, a lot more history, but almost all of the theory is still mainstream, and there's still a real focus on theory. It's certainly not pluralist, critical, and real world as we would recognize it. But what I've seen recently is Wendy Carlin, the chief architect of core, and Samuel Bowles, another very well-renowned economist who's been heavily involved in it, wrote a paper in the Journal of Economic Literature where they discussed basically their vision for economics education. And it was mostly pretty good, and I agreed with a lot of it. And they mentioned the student movement, and they mentioned pluralism, which was really great to see that in such a high-ranked economics journal. But they started to claim that they were being pluralist, in a sense. And what they did was they contrasted 2 ideas. So they said that we were pro pluralism as a kind of tournament of ideas, where you know, there's competing ideas and the students choose from one, and they thought that would be confusing, it would be too convoluted, it would be perhaps too tribal. And they contrasted this with this idea of pluralism by integration. So that's the idea that you get, you integrate theories into the mainstream, precisely what I was describing before. And it was interesting that they used an example which was just so bizarre, because they used the example of Marx. And they said that something along the lines of modern neoclassical models, where where employers can't observe workers, the amount of effort workers put in, right, and therefore have to pay them more to induce that effort, were like integrating Marx into economics. And I don't understand how you could possibly think that Marx, who obviously thought that the labor relationship was exploitative, no matter what the surveillance technology was being captured by that type of model. That's just clearly false to me. And so if you want to advertise pluralism by integration, I really think that's not a great example. And it's actually it's a great example of the opposite, of how integrating things into the mainstream often butchers them. And so for me, I don't see pluralism as this idea of a battling tournament. I see it can be, right? But pluralism by integration, I think the crucial thing is, and this is this idea of critical pluralism, the student can do the integration themselves. They're the ones who come up with their own argument and who assimilate different theories into a conclusion. And so there can be integration, there can be battles of ideas. That's really up to the students. And that is what education is about, right? So I don't see how this idea of pluralism by integration captures what we want. And I think we need to be careful about that argument, because they're using the word pluralism, but they're not using it in the way that we are. And I think sticking to those three pillars, pluralist, critical, and real world, will allow us to kind of avoid that drop down, if you remember the tightrope analogy from ages ago. So so that's kind of where I am. And I think just to speak a little bit to the practical side of things, I just want to mention there is a really good guide by Andy Meerman called Teaching Heterodox Economics and Pluralism in Practice, where he speaks about 3 different levels of pluralism. So he talks to, there's one idea where you just supplement existing modules by having, you know, maybe some more context at the start. The first lecture is like more context, history, more facts, right? Not just delving straight into the models, which is what some modules are like now. And then maybe at the end, you could discuss a little bit of criticism of the model, or test it against evidence, or introduce an alternative. And that's the way the lectures would be. And then in an exam, it might be a kind of similar format. Like, yeah, you keep a lot of the derivation, so they don't have to, you know, completely change everything. But at the end, you've got a little question that introduces another idea, and that makes the student think about it. So there's little practical suggestions like that, which are pretty good. I feel like I've gone over time.
Nah, you're pretty much bang on, to be honest. It's been 15 minutes. So. It's
been 15 minutes. Okay, so that's yeah. I'll stop there. But Andy has some more suggestions, which are all quite practical and nice. So let's finish there. Let's finish there.
Okay, cool. I would very much like you to share that that guide you were talking about, because that is really useful. Because I've basically been a rethinker for 4 years, and I've been at my university. It's kind of one of those small universities which kind of has to adapt to be sexy, so to speak. Thus, it's been a lot of opportunities for us to do actual rethinking of the economics curriculum, and there we constantly run into the issue that there are no sort of low-hanging fruits in terms of reforming the economics education. I mean, yes, there are textbooks, but they are so different from what the lecturers are used to teaching, so that they don't pick them up. It's not easy enough. You know, there are no easy alternatives to like do the actual pluralism part. Although it doesn't need to be, you know, game changing or anything, but it's just so tough to get all the lecturers in to do it. Yeah. That's just, sorry, I just had to get a little bit of frustration out there, you know how it is. Anyway, so we've reached the bit of this session where we are supposed to do like a bit of a Q&A. We can keep it a bit conversational if you want. I see we don't have that many questions in on the Q&A tab yet, so if people want to chime in with their questions, please raise your hands. Otherwise, I think I want to hear from you, Jo. Do you have any thoughts? Did anything that Cahal say, did that sort of evoke any response on your part, or do you agree with him, or do you disagree with him, or?
Yeah, I mean, this question about sort of integration, you know, absorbing pluralism into you know, a sort of then, you know, here is the textbook, here is what economists think, and we've absorbed some ideas from other places, versus presenting it as a, you know, a set of contested ideas and presenting a range of opinions, I think is a really important issue. And again, I think there's this issue of how to present this stuff to students in a way that doesn't just completely overwhelm and sort of lead to meltdown. And anecdotally, I've heard from somebody who's taught the core curriculum, and what the core curriculum does, at least one thing it tries to do, is instead of starting with the very basic, and as Cahal says, not easy, difficult, the very basic, you know, confusing neoclassical supply and demand framework, and then adding frictions and adding sort of deviations from perfect competition and so on. What they do is at least partially kind of start with some more complex stuff, start with some game theory, some Nash equilibria, some imperfect information kind of stuff, and say, look, these are the kinds of results you get, and these are the justifications then for policy to intervene and change things. But the maths is a bit more complicated, so this is kind of like a preview, and now we're going to go back and give you the building blocks and you'll get to it. And what I heard, and again this is anecdotal, was that what this kind of said to students is, you know, anything goes. You know, you can kind of just, you know, you're not constrained actually to a particular framework or a particular set of logic, so you can kind of decide whatever you like. And what I was told was that this actually had, in many cases, kind of catastrophic results, because students would then write things that were, you know, to my mind, awful, you know, racist or sexist or something, thinking that, well, you know, I can justify this by adding a friction or something to my neoclassical model. So the view that came out was that actually they'd been better off with Manque, because at least that kind of constrained them to come up with a particular set of bad ideas, whereas core almost just opened up the box and said, you know, do whatever you like, and, you know, you can build a model at some point which will justify it. So it's a big question. You know, we have to be very careful about, you know, absorption versus contestation. But I think if you teach history of economic thought properly, there's no way that you're ever going to have, you're never going to escape the idea of contestation, because you're going to see the subject developing as a sequence of ideas put forward, influenced by what was happening around you. You know, Ricardo and Malthus were influenced by fears about food production and population growth. Keynes was influenced by the Great Depression, and so on. And then other people coming along and saying, no, your idea is wrong because of this, to then try and say, well, look, you know, here's the final synthesis. You know, obviously it's different to how it would have been 10 years ago because of the crisis, or 5 years ago because of coronavirus and all the things which are going to change because of that. But this is the right one. You know, this is definitely the right one now, which will stop. So I think I kind of rambled a bit there, but I think it's very clear that you have to teach it as contested ideas, but try and give people as much of the analytical and you know, be as truthful, and teach each discipline as close to and faithfully as you can to the originals and to the original ideas, and let people try and deal with these ideas. But they're very difficult. I mean, I still find it hard to, you know, hold an Austrian and a Keynesian idea of banking alongside a neoclassical in my mind all at once, and then try and compare and contrast, because they're just different shapes, you know, different numbers of dimensions. You know, you're comparing things which are so, you know, feel fundamentally different. It's okay. There are quite a few questions here in this.
Yeah, there are some questions. And
so should we try and
yeah, let's do that. We've also got someone who wants to talk. So that's Paul Hudson. So please, Paul, I'll unmute you now, and you can answer you can ask your question. Please say where you're from and sort of what level you're at, if you're studying economics, or if you're doing a PhD, or if you're doing something completely different. So over to you, Paul. You're unmuted. So
I think you're muted on your end, Paul, if you haven't seen. I think you've muted yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I've unmuted you.
Let's take a couple from the
let's
Q&A
do
box.
Q&A.
Try and come back to Paul.
Okay, so should we start at the top? Do you wanna take the first question, Joe, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, should I just kind of have a look at what's in the box and
all right, I
work
can.
through a few of them?
Okay, cool.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, there he is.
All right.
Okay, let's do Paul then,
Well,
and then we can do the
very
Q&A
much
box.
indeed. Good to see Jo again. I hadn't met Cahal before. I very much liked Jo's syllabus. I think that could be done actually if the students worked one way or another, lectures, reading, and the rest of it for 25 hours a day, 8 days a week, and 153 weeks. The one thing that I was a bit disappointed, and I'm reflecting, of course, my own experience. Of course, I'm heading for about 100 years of age at the moment. But if there's any one particular area, if I had my arm twisted, any one area that was of most use for me a long time, and that was the study of logic and philosophy, in particular a branch of philosophy known as epistemology. And I think that made one very aware of how difficult it is to get to the truth. As regards the economic history, I think that depends, in fact, on the books. It so happens I'm just rereading Roger Backhouse's History of Economics. It's a brilliantly written book, and I think even somebody who's not even studied economics before would have
sorry to cut you short, Paul, but
so I just wonder why
I have to ask your question.
Yeah, so I wonder why it is that either Jo or Cahal seem to ignore, in fact, logic and epistemology in their ideal syllabus, given that philosophy is so basic, in fact, to every subject, science or non-science.
Do you want, I'll just give you a very honest, very quick answer. I'm still not 100% sure what epistemology means, so I wouldn't want to talk to it too much because I've literally had no education in it. But it's not that I don't agree with you, it's important, but I just guess it's a question of space and priorities. But maybe Jo can give you a more serious answer.
I'm in the process of adding a new module to the UE first year syllabus, which is called Economic Reasoning, and the spec is actually inductive logic, deductive logic, abductive logic. So it absolutely should be there, and I'm in the process of adding it. I'm not sure why I didn't think of including it in my list of things. There are things missing, certainly, from my draft. Somebody else that I see in the questions box has said, haven't you got something about ecological economics and so on? I mentioned at the beginning about accounting, but absolutely right. Yes, there should be a fairly substantial chunk about thinking about the economics of the environment. So yeah, I agree effectively with both of those comments.
Okay, so I mean, that could effectively be part of like a macro course, couldn't it? I mean, like if you go through system dynamics and sort of models like that, it's completely consistent with that kind of thinking. So I'll just read out the top rated question here. So it's basically, it asks, one of the things he's noticed about rethinking is that we have a tendency to move to more left-wing perspectives. So if we're a bunch of like covert Marxists, and a lot of members do have a preference for certain schools. So how can we ensure pluralism for the movement? So also sort of including people who aren't down with Daddy Marx or things like that. I don't know.
I see that the person who asked this one has also asked in the chat if they could ask something kind of live. Should we let them come in and just see if they want to expand on the question a bit?
Yeah, okay, sure. Cohen, word's yours.
Thank you. Yeah, this was mostly the question. It was especially with the second one that had a couple more comments. It was the second most upvoted question. But you said it quite perfectly how we can ensure that everyone, since we have some people that don't agree with Daddy Marx, how we can ensure that everyone stays happy within the movement. Because I noticed we have a tendency to attract more people with a specific perspective, and I agree with that perspective, but I think it might be an issue that, for instance, in these talks, in the seminars, we often seem to also equate the Austrian school with an intensified version of neoclassical economics, if you see also the speakers. And to some extent, I think it is fair, but if you also want to have a pluralist perspective, you may want to consider how we approach this narrative, because right now we seem to be especially focused on a certain subset of schools.
Okay, Cahal, do you want to jump in first? Because it's kind of about your or shall I say something first? I've got something to say on it, but it's going to upset everybody. So
I think
I'll butter them up and then you can upset them.
Okay.
So I really agree with you. I couldn't agree more. I mean, you know, it's no secret that most of the people that populate Rethinking Economics are lefty, right? I just think if you're calling for radical change to economics, you're just not going to attract right wingers or even centrists. It's just the way it is. And so we have to kind of, when trying to include Austrian economists, for example, or even mainstream economists who aren't as sympathetic to us, we find ourselves swimming against the tide just because the networks that we move in don't necessarily give us quick access to those people. You know, if I want a post-Keynesian, I can name 10 people immediately. If I want an Austrian, then I really have to think, right? And but I do, you know, I think one of the things that I've found, because I've been writing a lot about lots of different schools recently, there's always something good in a perspective that you think you disagree with. I've been reading some of the stuff, some of the historical stuff on free banking, for instance, and it really surprised me with how interesting and historically in depth it was. You know, sort of free banking is not having a central bank, by the way, it's having private banks. And at first I thought, oh, that's stupid, you know, it's crazy. But no, you know, there's some really great stuff by people like George Selgin and Larry White. And I think we have to try harder to recruit these people and include them in conferences like this, because even if I'm not a free banker now, I appreciate it as a position. And there's plenty of other examples. I think there's a lot of merit in Austrian ideas. And now Joe's going to tell you why he doesn't think that.
This is a really difficult one for me, and I don't have a solution, but I have some views which are probably not going to be very useful for what you guys are trying to do, because they're probably not, you know, sort of all one big happy family. There's a related question about what is heterodox economics, and some people say it's everything which isn't mainstream, and some people say it's the economics of the left, and that effectively by arguing for heterodox perspectives, post-Keynesian, Marxist, feminist, ecological, etc., you're basically trying to move the debate to the left. And I'm actually of that camp. I do think that heterodox economics, you know, with the exception of Austrian economics, is the economics of the left. And I do think that the problem has been too much reliance on market mechanisms for the last 40 years. And so my desire to reform the curriculum is about trying to develop a better economic system. And that is one which I think has more effective government action, not necessarily bigger government, but more effective understanding of what governments can do. So I'm not convinced that I would include Austrian economics in heterodox economics. It's a non-mainstream group. So then what about pluralism? Is Austrian in pluralist? Yeah, of course it is, if you're going to define pluralist as everything outside the mainstream. And I absolutely agree with Cahal that there is lots of useful and interesting stuff in Austrian economics. I think all economics students should read Hayek, for example. They should read Hayek's stuff on monetary economics. In particular, when I read Austrian stuff, I always kind of find myself thinking, yeah, I agree with nearly all of this, until we get to the punchline, and you're like, whoa, you know, where did that come from? You know, it's almost like post-Keynesian economics until you get to the punchline, and then you think, where did you come? How did you get to there from where you were? So I don't know, is the honest answer, how you guys deal with that, because it's a mess, I think. I mean, I do think heterodox economics, which is the big bulk of what the push for pluralism is about, is kind of from the left. But maybe I'm letting secrets out that shouldn't be let out.
Maybe.
Because even Cahal's face is like, no.
I think if you have to adopt the position of epistemological pluralism there, you know, and ontological. So ontological is a theory of reality for those who haven't been familiar with that word. I think, you know what, I think philosophy of science actually could really help there in how to remain pluralist, because there you sort of engage with a lot of different ideas, and you don't necessarily you explore them and you measure them against each other, but you don't really pick winners as such. I mean, of course you assume a position and argue for something, but you know, it's kind of open in that way. And I think a lot of economics could perhaps learn a lot from how philosophy is taught, I'd say. So that's my 2 cents on that. Let's move over to a question from Matt Kelly, because he highlights something that's quite important actually. So how can anyone comment on how like these pluralist ideas and ambitions are impacting high school curricula? because students that achieve good grades at A levels and IB are already on their way to being quite shaped by the mainstream thoughts. Yeah, so do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and one I meant to raise in my talk and forgot to. I just want to say one final thing in response to the point you made, which is that despite what I said, I do try and teach as even-handedly as possible. And at the end of modules, I quite often, the students say to me, this is really interesting. You told us all these different perspectives. Which one are you? You're a new Keynesian, aren't you? Or, you know, you're a sort of neoclassical person, aren't you? So I think I do try and teach this stuff even-handedly, despite having my own, of course, preconceptions. What about A levels? This is a really important issue, and it's one of the issues about reforming the current curriculum, because people come in with a very clear idea of what economics is. And if you try to teach the curriculum, which I outlined at the beginning, the kind of ideal world one, to people who've done A-level economics, it isn't going to work. They're going to think, you know, this person's mad. And I often find it's more difficult to teach people who've done A-level economics than those who haven't done any economics, because they know that supply and demand are laws, and you just have to draw the graphs, and all the other stuff is kind of, you know, the stuff I'm talking about is wrong, effectively. And I think I'm reasonably good at doing a bit of unlearning stuff. I've kind of got various strategies, questions to ask, you know, okay, tell me what your model tells me about this, which, you know, instantly gets, oh, okay, hold on a minute, maybe this model isn't quite finished. So there's a big debate about whether, I mean, in my mind, whether students should whether there should be an A-level economics. And I have to be careful about this, because sometimes I talk to people who teach A-level economics and they say, look, we really need your help to defend us because the schools want to take A-level economics out. So unless the universities make it compulsory, we're going to lose A-level economics. And I have to sort of bite my lip a little bit, because I sort of think probably they should not do economics yet. They should wait till they get to university. So I think it's just another thing for us to manage and to be aware of. I think I'd love to see some kind of campaign or some kind of ideas about changing A-level economics, which my impression is it's very narrow. And it's often taught by, for example, people who are teaching business, you know, IT and 3 other things as a portfolio. So the people who teach it really are not going to have the training and the understanding to teach it critically. So the students are going to get a very, you know, weird potted understanding of supply and demand. So for now, we have to manage it. Maybe Cahal's got some smarter ideas on how to deal with that.
I'm not sure that I do. I'm not sure that I do. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I differ from Jo there, because I've actually found that A-level economics has been a little bit more responsive to our campaign than the universities were. Certainly at first, I remember the financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis. I need to stop talking about that, because it just doesn't seem significant anymore. Nobody cares about it anymore. But it was the galvanizing force for our campaign. It was incorporated into A levels quite rapidly following the crisis. And I found with A levels, I guess experiences differ, but we were expected to write essays, and we were expected to think a little bit more critically. So I actually found I was disappointed when I went to university, precisely because my A levels, although they contained all these models, they were better. So I was kind of holding out on A-level economics as a bit of a bastion of hope, but Jo's kind of dashed those hopes against the rocks, I suppose. I'm not sure.
Right.
That may be my ignorance. I mean, I think probably A-level teachers are very open and willing for new ideas, but probably they're even under more pressure, and, you know, materials aren't there and so on. So I don't think it's unwillingness on the part of the teachers. I think it's probably more sort of path dependence that's the issue there.
Well, so we've talked a little bit about, you know, introducing history of economic thought and sort of move away from the sort of mathematical formalism a little bit. So a lot of students say, or some students say when they encounter this, that they find it tedious, difficult, and complain that we are putting things which do not belong in an economics education. So how do we counter sort of that sentiment among students? Because you do, I mean, ultimately you will have defenders of how things are right now. You know, not everyone shares the notion of that something is wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think first, just turn it around and say, justify to me why you think students of a particular subject should not be told anything about the history of that subject. You know, why should they not understand something about how we got to where we are? I think second, it's about how you teach it. And I teach a first year history of economic thought module. There are certainly some people who don't like it and don't get it, but I do, you know, with the risk of kind of blowing my own trumpet, regularly students come up and say, that changed my mind and actually affected the whole way I went through the rest. I think affected the whole way I went through the rest of my degree program, because maybe I'd done A-level economics. Then you talked, you know, about 6 weeks about the history of economic thought. And then I changed my mind about a whole bunch of different things. And now I see it differently. So I think, you know, it can be taught in a way which is interesting. I mean, I enjoy teaching history of economic thought probably more than anything else I teach. I also don't think we should see it as moving away necessarily from mathematical and formalist ideas, because I teach Ricardo's model, which is, you know, very much a very difficult mathematical formal model. We go through the marginalist stuff, and we go through Jevons and Edgeworth and stuff, alongside Marx and Smith and so on, which is less immediately formalized, or it can be formalized. So I don't think we should treat it as moving away necessarily from formal theory. It's seeing a different range of formal theories to a degree.
Okay, very good. Do you have anything to add on that, Joe, or was that about a nail on the head?
Presume you meant.
No, sorry, Cahal.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I kind of disagree with the question, to be honest. It hasn't been my experience. I find there's a lot of curriculum reviews and surveys of students done by people like Cambridge and post-crash economics, where they seem to find quite an appetite for these types of courses. So we ran an economic history module at Manchester. We started it shortly after post-crash. It was one of the things the department sort of put on partly in response to our campaign. And there, you know, it had about 100 students, which was quite a lot for a kind of an optional module. So I feel like there is an appetite for those things. I mean, again, experiences will differ from university to university, but I'm quite positive about students wanting to learn economic history and history of thought.
Okay. I think Andreas Stoller here raises a really good question regarding in what sort to do with economics, because he highlights that there are like completely new courses that are heterodox or pluralist, you know, out there. Are we better off just creating new ones from scratch? Because then we are no longer bound by the institutional framework in which we sort of operate, you know, namely, as you said, Joe, that ultimately a bachelor in economics needs to be compatible with master's courses out there. You need to have enough credits to get into those courses, and that is a hard limit in many cases. So should we start anew somewhere else?
Yeah, this is a difficult one. I mean, I don't think it's a binary. I mean, I don't think of it as, you know, the one option is to have a kind of pluralist, mixed, hybrid degree program, and one is just to have a pure heterodox degree program. Because, you know, in the same way that I think you need to know the history of the subject, you know, a heterodox degree program needs to teach the history of the subject, and that involves learning the techniques as well as just knowing that there is a thing called neoclassical economics. So I'm not sure I would, yeah, I don't know what a pure heterodox program would actually mean. I mean, does that just mean you don't do anything of what's currently in the textbooks, and you never see a solo model and you're not aware of it? Because I wouldn't be completely comfortable with that. And I do think the solo model tells us something really interesting. It tells us that by introducing factor substitutability, you get away from the knife edge instability of the Harrod-Domar model, which, you know, is in itself useful and interesting. It just doesn't mean that you then do a million years of growth accounting where you measure something which doesn't exist, called total factor productivity. So I'm kind of the view that we need some of everything, and we need the right mix. maybe at master's level, that's not the case so much. Maybe at master's level, people have decided, you know, I really want to just spend a year learning about Kaleckian growth models and learning political economy of development, and I want to specialize. But I think at undergrad level, we do need to have a breadth which represents, you know, the actually existing subject as it stands. I don't know if that's answered the question or not.
I think there's a danger with that type of thing. I mean, there was a lecturer that I spoke to, a mainstream lecturer, who his whole argument was that he thinks that heterodox programs already do exist, which is true. And he felt that that made your choice of degree pluralist overall, if you think about every university. So that allows the criticism of pluralism to kind of be dismissed, and it's an excuse for universities not to change, at least not in the way that we want, especially the kind of higher ranked universities. And, you know, we can moan about what that means and how it's come to be, but it is the reality at the moment. So I don't like that, because I think that it can function as a kind of safety valve for these criticisms and prevent the existing programs from changing to pluralist ones.
Well, that is a really, really good point. I hope that answered the question there, Andreas. You raised a really good point.
Yeah, and it could reinforce existing hierarchies where low-ranked institutions which aren't worth anything can do a bit of pluralism, and then if you want a real degree, then you need to come here and do some maths.
And furthermore, I'd say that creates just another parallel system, or parallel silo of journals as well, because I think that, well, obviously part of the problem comes really from the journal system, as far as I've understood, you know, like, so the journals are sort of everything, and then the PhD follow from that, and then the postgraduate/master studies follow from that, and then, you know, in the end, it's the undergraduate. So I've sometimes questioned myself, are we really working at this from the right end, so to speak? Because it seems to me it always follows from the top. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. I mean, the pressure from below is having an effect. Clearly, it's having an effect, and it's having a positive effect. There are problems with the journal publishing, peer review. I mean, the whole model is a mess. Even putting aside the issue of, you know, the top 5 journals basically only publishing a particular narrow approach, the whole model of paywall journals and peer review in the modern age of the internet is a disaster and needs to be reformed wholesale. But I do think that there is pressure coming from, you know, the ability of blogs and online events and open source material is putting pressure on that stuff. But yeah, the stranglehold of the top 5 journals on people's employment prospects effectively is a massive institutional problem. I don't know what we do about it other than just complain as much as we can and make people aware of it. And the fact that some of these, one particular journal editor is shaming himself in public at the moment only adds to the problem.
I think it relates, actually, sorry, can I just add, it also
sure.
To Cohen's question earlier, right, about pluralism, and because if we silo ourselves off, then we do risk becoming that kind of, just the kind of left-wing alternative type of economics, as opposed to actual pluralism, which I think is, you know, you can have your views on what you think should go into policy, but certainly as a teacher, I wouldn't be happy with not teaching my students the full range of things, and having the challenge there from the mainstream, you know, to an extent, not entirely, but that is a bit what pluralism's about, right? And so I think we need to embrace that a little bit instead of just complaining about it. We can complain about it too, but also I think it can be intellectually fruitful, and it has been.
And siloing ourselves also sets us up for being killed. I mean, if all the pluralist stuff is in 2 journals and 3 universities, then when the fascists come to power, they know which 3 journals and which 3 universities to kill, right? And then you never get it back. So yeah, we want to get our tentacles everywhere,
right? Not to sound conspiratorial or anything. No, but I think that is a really good point. Let's see, we've covered a lot of grounds, and we've still got 17 attendees with us. I hope that this conversation is engaging. I mean, we could sit here for all evening. At least I know I could. I was just wondering if we should call it a day soon, or if we should keep going. I mean, let us know in the chat. We could do one or two more questions. I think I want to raise one thing that we haven't talked about that much yet. It's the nitty-gritty hierarchies of how faculties function. So part of getting a pluralist education, or getting the change that we want to see, is actually to get in on the committees that decide what sort of qualities to look for when they are hiring people. And who decides the funding for the PhD programs. We've had some limited success of that, of that in Norway. I was part of recruiting the dean, and that did lead to certain good outcomes for us, because, if you have someone who's personally sympathetic to your sentiments, then it's suddenly much easier to be heard, for once. So I'm not sure about the UK system, but is there any sort of platform for students to be heard on, or to be able to help make those decisions? Or is that just in my little weird corner of the world?
No, I think there is something to say here, which is that universities do listen to students in a way that they don't listen to academic staff, in my experience. If they're aware that there is dissatisfaction in the student body, they tend to react a lot more quickly than if there's dissatisfaction in the academic staff. And that economics kind of fundamentalism, i.e. mainstream economics fundamentalism, doesn't extend much beyond the academic economics departments themselves. Once you get up to faculty level, to the deans and to the kind of cross-border funding bodies, or to business schools, for example. I'm in a business school, and a lot of heterodox people in this country are in business schools because they just don't have the same kind of path dependency and attachment to a particular set of intellectual ideas. So one approach is to kind of just to bypass the economists and go further up the tree and make perfectly reasonable arguments about, this is how you can market your course as having a unique selling point, and this is what all the students are after these days, and this stuff is out of date, and you want to be cutting edge, and throw in some buzzwords that these guys kind of like, or these people kind of like. I think it can be quite an effective strategy. I mean, it depends on the specific institutional structure and whether you've got an economics professor sitting on the board or whatever. But in my experience, I've seen successful. I've seen this work in practice on more than one occasion.
Jo, any thoughts, Cahal?
On academic hierarchies, and can I say no?
No, all right. Yeah, that's completely legit. I mean, systems vary in different countries, so it's easier to create change in some places and more difficult to do so in other places. Yeah, let's see. There's some questions there about the marginalist and neoclassical way of thinking spreading to other social sciences. I mean, they're a little outside of what we are trying to get at in this session, but I suppose we can do one of those questions anyway, because I think it sort of gets at something with the siloing that is, this siloed way of thinking, asking narrow quantifiable questions within a science. Is that sort of like a thing that we are seeing not only in economics, but is it also spreading? Is social sciences in general becoming neoclassicalized?
I think it's a good point, and I think it does overlap with what we're talking about, because people want economists to teach on other degree programs because they've got all these rigorous techniques which sociologists and psychologists and so on haven't quite yet got the hang of. I mean, I'm caricaturing a bit, but I think there's sometimes it's explicit. There are economics papers, which there's the famous Lazier one where he says economics is the crown prince of the social sciences, and we're going to go out and we're going to, I think he uses the word colonize, or we're going to be imperial, and we're going to teach all of these other lower social sciences our kind of techniques. And then there are other places where it's much less explicit and it's implicit. And there's good heterodox critique on this. I like Ben Fine's stuff on economics imperialism. It's worth looking up. But I mean, actually, Cahal's done some good stuff on this about this current bunch of people. I'm thinking of Pinker and what's the guy's name, Jordan Peterson. This kind of very crude, quantitative. It's all in the OLS and the multivariate regressions. And once you're scientific, you find out that really, so right wing is the only sensible political perspective in the world. Cahal, I'll say something more about this. He can be more eloquent on these people. But I think it's very dangerous. I do see it I don't know the other subjects very well, but when I look at, for example, psychology, I'm kind of alarmed these days at, a very crude, even kind of below neoclassical level approach to individualism and this kind of, this view of human nature, which I think I do recognize from Homo economicus, does seem to be appearing more and more in other places. And I don't think it's a good trend. I think we have to resist it, point it out and resist it. Cal, say something clever about this. You're good at this stuff.
If you get me talking about Steven Pinker, then we will be here all night.
All right, I got some wine.
I think a little bit of statistical knowledge is a dangerous thing, and I am routinely shocked by the way that people especially people like Steven Pinker or maybe Jordan Peterson use statistics. I think they get it completely wrong. And also, I think Joe's right that the other social sciences are now saying, well, because of this perceived intellectual superiority, whether it's of economics or whether it's just of maths in general, and economics is a kind of conduit for that into the social sciences, I'm not sure. But there's this idea that that statistical methods are superior, and you get political scientists increasingly becoming quantitative. But and this is I guess a compliment to economists. Economists do it much better. They do understand more causality much better than the other social sciences. And there's a real danger of kind of partially importing these things. But I guess let me relate this back to the curriculum. And actually it relates to what Joe was talking about earlier. I don't know if you should be using advanced statistical methods until late in your degree. I think you need to learn about all the problems with measurement. You need to learn about all of the problems with functional form. You need to understand when something's statistically explained by something else, you need to know what that means, because that doesn't actually mean the two are necessarily related in any kind of concrete way. And so things like that, you really need to grapple with those. And I don't think economists fully do it. They're certainly not in the way it's taught. I don't think they even fully do it in their research. I think other social scientists are even worse. And then at the very bottom of that pyramid, you have people like Steven Pinker and Jordan Peterson, who really don't know what they're doing with statistics. So I'm not blaming economists for those two, or Ben Shapiro either, but they definitely suffer from the same kind of misplaced reverence for statistics at increasingly advanced levels as you go up that pyramid.
And we're also seeing this in government at the moment in a kind of bizarre way. I mean, there was this Dominic Cummings job advert that was rightly ridiculed, and then Gove made some ridiculous statements recently. So we've got this spectacle of a bunch of arts graduates, because none of them have got what they think of as quant degrees, computer science or economics or something, who think that, in order to do anything, you have to have a quant degree, and yet those guys still think that they're qualified to run the country, even though they hate their own, degree qualifications. So it's a mess, clearly.
Well, I'm looking at the time now, and we've passed 1 hour and 20 minutes. I think that is a tall order for anyone to watch afterwards. I think we better round up, because otherwise I think people in retrospect will be scared at the length of this session. Although I truly could sit here for 2 more hours, because it's been very interesting to chat with the two of you, and I'm very glad that we could do this session. So I want to thank both of you for taking time on a Saturday to do this. and I want to thank all the attendees for also doing the same. Yeah, so Cecilia was saying that there is a survey that we're doing for people who, I think it's for people who are doing economics educations. So please have a look at that. It's been shared in the chat. Cecilia, you could probably share that once more because the chat is, you know, going fast, quick upwards. Finally, do you guys, I guess both of you two have pluggables that you want to plug. So I'll let you plug first, Jo, and then you can plug afterwards, Cahal.
No, let Cahal go first. I'm trying to think of something to plug. I haven't got anything immediately to mind, but I just want to say thanks to everybody for the questions. Actually, the questions have been really good, and I found the conversation really interesting. I'll try and think of something to plug for a moment while Cahal plugs.
Yeah, excellent. No, it's been really, really casual, but also very intellectually stimulating. So thank you, everybody. What I would plug is probably the Pluralist Showcase, which I said I've been writing a lot about different perspectives. So this is my attempt to dip into virtually every single one I can find. And I've been writing roughly a blog post a month. So yeah, the Pluralist Showcase, you can find it on the Rethinking Economics website. You can find it on the Exploring Economics website as well. And it's just like short, 1,000 to 2,000 word blog posts exploring a particular theory. Free banking is an example that I gave you earlier, and how well it accords with various types of evidence. I'm currently writing about qualitative research, which speaks to that quantitative question we were saying, because it's really good qualitative research. And I think even heterodox economists don't appreciate it sometimes. I think it may even be the way forward. So yeah, that's my plug.
Good, I agree. I still haven't thought of anything to plug, so I'm just going to plug whatever Cahal said.
All right. Well, I'm gonna hijack what you said at the end there about qualitative research. So, because yes, this is how we deal with complexity. At least according to one of my philosophy of science teachers. Her name is Rani Anjum, and she's written on causality. Like, look her up, and her with the latest book with a guy called Stephen Mumford. It is really, really good and really enlightening. I think everyone should read her book on causation, because that's where all the problems start. So, oh yeah, and look up economy studies. They're trying to create something easy to implement for teachers who teach economics. And also, I forgot to say this in the last session, but I'm saying it now. Please see the Can Black Lives Matter in Economics session. It's very important. And lastly, I'm just going to say thank you for tuning in. And have a nice Saturday evening.